But I'm also especially glad to be here to talk about women, as it's obviously, I think, a wonderful thing that women's roles in major events are now seen as absolutely normal. And times really have changed in some ways quite quickly. I don't know if, I tried to have a look, but I think 50 years ago when the war was being commemorated, nobody would have thought of asking somebody to come and talk about women. It just didn't happen. And it might not have happened even 20 years ago. So this is obviously a good thing, that women's stories are being told and are being seen as central to the broader narrative of the war. But it's also the case, and I was just talking to Myrtle Hill about this, that looking at women in one session like this obviously has to beg the question of what the other sessions were about, or all the other articles in the book that aren't about women are about. Is it true that people like me and Myrtle and various others who work on women are faced with trying to say an awful lot about everything to do with women in one section? And I think, for the sake of comparison, imagine this series with 3 lectures about women and somebody asked to come and give 1 lecture about men in the First World War. It just wouldn't happen. So, you know, it goes without saying that this is me absolutely scratching the surface and trying to say a little bit about a lot of things, because women are half the population and they're involved in pretty much everything that happened during the war. Not so much on the front lines in some ways, but in some ways they were there as well. So, one of the best things though, and one of the things that makes working on women in war so rewarding at the moment, I think, is that this commemoration has really initiated so much new research. And what we know about Ireland, and about men and women, about the home front, and about the front line during those war years has expanded really rapidly recently. Now, all of you are clearly interested in history, so you all know that the question of Ireland's involvement in the First World War has been a difficult one in more ways than one since the war began 100 years ago. Recent events in this commemoration, 100 years, have allowed us to study manifold impacts of the war on Irish life and society in new ways. And I think in some ways, more importantly, on its own terms. So we can look at the war and we can see how the war impacted on Irish life without necessarily seeing that as a reflection or a product or even a cause of the political crisis which was sweeping over Ireland in the early 20th century, obviously Home Rule. It's not to say that the war and Home Rule aren't connected, they are, but they're not always. The first thing I'd say about women and war in Ireland is that, at least as far as it's reflected in my own research, the First World War really did have a profound effect on women in Ireland. And it changed their lives, I think, temporarily and in longer lasting ways. And there's a lot of debate about this in academic circles. Did the war really change anything for women? Was the vote really a product of the war? I don't think the vote was a product of the war, but I also think that the war did help to change lives in lots of ways. In some ways that it might seem quite trivial, but in the long run were actually quite important. The other thing to say about Irish women, which I think makes them different from women in Britain and other parts of the Western world and in the Empire at the time, was that they were exceptionally well placed in 1914 to adapt very quickly and efficiently to the challenges that were initiated by the declaration of war in August 1914. Well, why were they? What made Irish women so special? What put Irish women in a particular situation was that there existed in the country many, many lively and very efficient political and philanthropic networks throughout the country. And these networks, I think, end up providing a very strong foundation for a really very wide variety of war-related activity, especially in the voluntary sector. And these hundreds of existing societies were very quickly joined by a raft of new organisations which were established especially to coordinate Irish women's contribution to the war effort. And I'll be looking at some of these later on in the talk. Irish women were also very well organised in some ways, because so many of them, especially the types of women one would expect to come to the fore during a political crisis, political or otherwise, They were already allied to political causes and societies, and often in extremely institutionalised ways, so they knew how to behave in a crisis, they knew how to organise. They knew who thought like them, they knew where they lived, and they knew how to raise money and all those sorts of things. Philanthropic and social reform activism was extremely strong in Ireland, and especially strong here in the north, especially in the cities, Belfast, Dublin and Cork. Women being involved in any number of activities: temperance, anti-vice, anti-prostitution, anti-cruelty to children, prison reform, anti-vivisectionism. The Irish Vegetarian Society was very active, believe it or not. Its president was Miss Joint, which I think is fantastic. And as well as this, there are obviously hundreds and hundreds of church groups which women are very involved in, and then there's all the other organisations that I've been working on recently, like the Primrose League, which also had thousands of Irish female members. In addition to all of that, you have the Irish suffrage movement, which is lively and strong in 1914, and that also provides a real network of groups around the country of women who knew other women who were interested in being active, who were the types who would get out and campaign. And as I said, through all these groups, women had learned to organise, to lobby, to fundraise and to publicise. And these are all essential skills for the women who would run the voluntary war effort in Ireland. On top of all of that, we have the women who had become increasingly institutionally involved in the Home Rule crisis through their allegiance to nationalism and unionism, and they too would provide a crucial foundation. And this is especially true for the Ulster Women's Unionist Council, which is Ireland's largest women's political organisation by some stretch, and actually one of the very largest across the whole of the UK. It has more members than the Liberal Women's Federation, for example. Right, so there's some random pictures of them. That's their first meeting in the Ulster Hall. The Ulster Women's Council reacts extremely quickly to the announcement of war. It immediately suspends its political activities, a little bit like the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, and some other organisations, and it declares itself absolutely committed to supporting the empire. The Ulster Women's Council had been founded in 1911, so it was well established by 1914. And its remit on foundation was to support the work of the entirely male Ulster Unionist Council. But it quickly grows into a very significant organisation in its own right. And it's difficult to know how many members it had. Even Diane Urquhart's not sure, and she's really its main historian, but it's probably somewhere between 120 and 200,000 members, which is pretty extraordinary by 1918, formidable political group. And with a whole lot of stuff going on under the surface, I'm not entirely sure I can prove this just yet, but I'm pretty sure they do manage to extract a promise of women's suffrage in 1912 from the Ulster Unionist Council, which is something pretty amazing. Watch this space, I'll see if I can get some evidence for it. So this is a really well-established organisation. It's also pretty well-funded, which helps too. And it's compact, because mostly it's in the northeast of the country. So one of the first things that the Ulster Women's Unionist Council gets involved in is nursing and organising nursing corps during the war. Now, Lady Aberdeen, the wife of the what's he called? Lord Aberdeen, anyway. Lord Lieutenant, is usually credited for introducing the Red Cross to Ireland and getting the Red Cross going during the war, but she wasn't actually the one to do that. Women unionists had established Red Cross classes before the war even began, which is quite something. In October 1913, so almost a year before the war began, the Ulster Women's Unionist Council had called on the medical board of the Ulster Volunteer Force, and it suggested that a central authority be established which would coordinate nursing. The medical board approved of this, and it co-opted members of the Women's Council, and it went about to organise what it called the training and control of the various nursing corps of the Ulster Volunteer Army. I think I have a picture of them. And that's one of them. Sorry about the blurry pictures. It's sort of very difficult to get clear pictures of anything to do with Ireland and the war. So this is late 1913. We've already got. It looks like there's a war going on when you look at this picture. There are people, men looking like soldiers, women looking like nurses. Now, the aim of this scheme from 1913 was, of course, as they said, was to respond to the possible crisis in Irish politics. So unionist women from this period are actively organising themselves to resist Home Rule, and they form networks of voluntary aid units, or VADs as they're called, VADs. And these units are drilled and ready to tend to wounded unionists in the event of armed conflict over Home Rule. And they're given training in first aid, in cookery, in nursing, and that kind of thing. So they're pretty well, they're getting proper certificates and this sort of thing. So I think it's really, getting numbers of nurses, getting numbers of women who did anything during the war is extremely difficult, because most of the kind of institutional organisations were run from London, and they didn't often register Irish women separately, so trying to even find out how many women joined the Red Cross is impossible. I mean, a lot of records are now open in London, and I've been in contact with them, but unless you know the name of the woman you're looking for, it's virtually impossible. I'm hoping one day we can get lots of money and somebody will go through them all. In the meantime, we can just have a few guesses. One thing we do know, which I think is very striking, is that before the war was even declared in August 1914, the Ulster VADs, the voluntary aid detachments, already had a membership of 3,500 women, which is pretty striking. And this is more in total than 3 other provinces would have combined by 1918. So there's a nice indication of how well organised people are, and how well organised women are in different parts of the country. So what about nationalist women? Well, they were also partially mobilised before the outbreak of war, but they're in a much, much weaker position than the unionist women, despite the fact that obviously nationalists outnumbered unionists across Ireland. There was no constitutional nationalist women's organisation. That was the problem at all. There was no women's organisation that was allied with the Irish Parliamentary Party, and it was virtually impossible for women to join the IPP. And I've got plenty of evidence of women trying to join, and they were absolutely stopped. The closest thing that nationalist Ireland had to a women's organisation was the ladies' auxiliaries of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and they weren't really into doing this kind of stuff. They were more into tea parties, being philanthropic and that sort of thing. They weren't really politically active. The only other nationalist organisation was Cumann na mBan. This is soon going to become Ireland's leading Republican women's organisation, though at most it probably only had about 20,000 members in 1918. But by the time that war's declared, it's still finding its feet. It's just been formed a few months before. There they are, looking very militaristic. This is taken in actually in 1917. Before that period, you wouldn't have found many Cumann na mBan women who actually had the uniform. It's quite rare to have it. Most of them didn't have enough money to buy it or make it. Cumann na mBan is interesting because when war breaks out, it's still nominally, it's not split, the volunteers aren't split, neither is Cumann na mBan. So some of its members do take some first aid classes through the Red Cross or the Women's National Health Association. This becomes incredibly complicated when volunteers split and then Cumann na mBan split into pro and anti-Redmond and war factions. Those who remain loyal to the Irish Parliamentary Party go off, and we don't quite know where they go because there isn't a constitutional nationalist organisation. But I've seen plenty of evidence of women, lots of quite well-known women who left Cumann na mBan because it was too Republican and ended up going into all sorts of war work, different kinds. Those who remained within Cumann na mBan were a little bit sneaky. They absolutely opposed the war, as you can imagine, but they took advantage of the opportunity to take these certificates, to take nursing certificates, which were free to take, and gave them a qualification that was recognised by the War Office and the Red Cross. So they're taking these lessons and these certificates, and this is going to become incredibly useful to them, particularly in 1916, when actually there are some really well-equipped and well-trained Cumann na mBan nurses, and they're also lucky because they're trained by people like Kathleen Lee, who's a doctor herself. So they actually get quite good training, which holds them in good stead later on. Now, nursing is one of the most important ways, as you can imagine, that Irish women contributed to the war effort. And despite what I've just been saying about Cumann na mBan and the Ulster Women's Unionist Council, Most women clearly go into nursing, most Irish women, because they wanted to do their bit. The country was at war, not through any political motivation, probably. The government had devolved the responsibility for organising voluntary nursing to the British Red Cross. And this at first led to some interesting debate between it and the National Council of Trained Unions, which was kind of like a trade union for nurses, for professional nurses. They were worried that professional nurses would be undercut by volunteers who are obviously free, and various organisations would take them on. There's actually very little evidence that this happened, mainly because any woman who was trained was so highly in demand. And there's an insatiable demand for these VADs, for these volunteers. I was just looking at some stuff upstairs in the reading room there. There's constant letters from London back to Belfast saying, give us more, we need more women, we need more women. We'll have them trained, we'll have them untrained, we'll have anything, just keep sending us these people. And within these VADs, these voluntary detachments, women are often trained to do different things, so they'll often have drivers, cooks, all sorts of different roles. But the voluntary detachment nurses usually qualified after training only for about 3 months, but professional nurses usually had several years of training and experience in hospitals, so they really were in very, very high demand. And most of the VADs who did end up in hospitals, and the Irish VADs worked in hospitals in Ireland and abroad as well, probably did fairly menial work, changing bandages, cleaning, things that trained nurses couldn't necessarily do. So between them, the British Red Cross and the Irish section of St John's Ambulance Association coordinated the civilian voluntary efforts. That included nursing and things like collecting moss and so on. And they did this for Munster, Connaught and Leinster. The Ulster Committee decided to operate separately, and its instructions came from Belfast Red Cross branch. So you have these 2 separate organisations already from 1914. And this demarcation in war work is replicated all over the place. I was quite surprised to find this, that most of the London-based organisations are allowing this to happen, not actually having any kind of argument with it, although it does create extra work. So you have separate war hospital supplies organisations, moss receiving and distributing depots, prisoners of war, relief committees, sailors' help societies, each of which had, as they said proudly, a separate and independent replica in Ulster. So in some ways, partition is a well-established fact of war relief. Here's some VADs. There's some Irish nurses in Serbia. This is courtesy of PRONI, thank you. It's one of my only non-bleary photos. This is a proper one. This is a VAD from Dublin, whose papers are in Trinity. Hilda Knight, the family sent this out. She's obviously having a good time. Whatever hospital she's in. This is Kingston in Dublin, obviously. There quite often these units would have 1 or 2 men, sometimes as a doctor, but not always. Sometimes they had female doctors. I was just looking at some very interesting lists upstairs for the Belfast VADs. What's really interesting is that most of them miss. There are hardly any misses in there. And there's a lot of letters going backwards and forwards between Belfast and London saying, look, we want to send you more women, but most of them can't afford to keep doing this as well as working. Most of the women who, according to the Belfast commander, were working women who found it very difficult to keep volunteering their time. And there's Marie Martin, also from Dublin, who serves abroad and in Ireland. Now, the scale of voluntary work outside nursing was immense, and there is some good evidence of this from the Red Cross reports after the war, where they claim in these reports, I have no way of verifying this, that proportionately Ireland contributed more voluntary war work than any other part of the United Kingdom, and particularly Cork, apparently. I don't know why that should be so, but that was the claim. So the Cork branch of the British Red Cross Society made, for example, 270,000 bandages, dressings, other types of hospital equipment, 500,000 articles of clothing intended for the use of soldiers, to the point where they were told, please stop sending us jumpers, socks, we really have got more than we need. And women up and down the country are knitting, sewing, collecting moss, eggs, and most of these women, I think, are doing this in addition to their paid work, and others are putting aside some of their domestic responsibilities to do their bit. But while women took up voluntary work in unprecedented numbers, some women workers feared for paid employment, and some urged what they described as women of leisure and independence to avoid taking up jobs which were desperately needed by poorer women who'd lost their own jobs. There was a desperate fear of women being undercut by volunteers. And others even suggested that the women who rushed into voluntary war work, especially nursing, would undercut the professional women whose livelihoods would be threatened. Now, the question of women's employment is a really live one during the war. And that's not only because they're sometimes expected to step into jobs that were once reserved for men, but also because the war appeared to have caused a great deal of economic hardship for some of them. And many women's organisations were very concerned about this, and with coordinating their own war work, but also ensuring that women who were already working were not impoverished through lack of employment or support during the war. And of course, this is the background of this always is nobody quite knows when this war is going to end. So everybody sort of, you know, there's lots and lots of reports coming out saying, well, obviously for the next 6 months after that will be okay. 6 months go by and then they'll say, well, perhaps another 6 months it'll be okay. Don't push down wages and so on. One of the more interesting organisations during this period is called the Irish Central Bureau for the Training and Employment of Women. This is actually set up in 1903. It's very interesting because it makes annual reports and talks a lot about what sort of jobs women are doing in Ireland. It helps women who want to take up paid work, it puts women in touch with employers and vice versa, coordinates training and so on. It considered closing down because it thought its members might be too busy working for the war. But it ended up staying open from 1914, and it became a kind of clearinghouse that produced some interesting information on what sort of things women are doing. And it found that not only was it inundated by inquiries from women who wanted to do war work, that was the main thing that was said to them, we want to do war work. Most women who wanted to do war work also wanted to be paid for it, that was the problem. But they were also compelled to deal with many what were described as war cases, and many of these were urgent, marked urgent, where women had lost their jobs during the war. Now, most of the women who inquired at the Bureau were young, but they kept talking about an unusually large number of elderly, untrained and unqualified women who presented themselves there, particularly in 1916 and 17. And now these women, it seems, had not worked before the war, not worked for money, but described themselves as compelled through the force of circumstances to find paid work. Now, I don't know if that's because a male relative was killed or something else had happened, we don't know. But there's quite a lot of discussion in various circles about older women finding it very, very difficult during the war. Lady Mayo, for one, who's involved in a lot of these organisations, writes lots of letters this time to Teresa Londonderry, recommending needle workers, in particular, to the School of Art in Dublin. She wants them to be involved in making the colours for the new Irish regiments. And she said to Teresa Londonderry that if the order didn't come, the school would close, and it would mean literally starvation to all the old women, for no one will employ them in these times. And again, this is, I don't have much evidence of this, but it's just something that is a real theme in a lot of this correspondence. So a number of women's groups took advantage of wartime economic conditions when seeking employment for women as well, so it could work to some people's advantage. The Suffrage Emergency Council, which I'll talk about a little bit later, set up classes in embroidery, woodwork, needlework, set up a toy-making factory for female workers. Now, these occupations probably seem very frivolous in the context of total war, but the women who'd been employed in manufacturing luxury goods were very hard hit, as you can imagine, by the war. And the Suffrage Emergency Council claimed that some of the women who came to their rooms looking for work actually fainted for want of food. Now, these women produced a good deal of items, the sorts of needlework and so on, and all these other things, toy making. They were chosen deliberately because these are the sorts of industries whose goods had been imported from Germany. So they tried to set up an alternative sort of industry, toys and so on. And a lot of these women were also trained to replace German workers, particularly waiters, who apparently had the monopoly on restaurants in Ireland. That was news to me. And their experiences reflected the wider retrenchment in non-essential industries which were hit hard by a collapse in luxury goods, including expensive clothing, textiles and fine furniture, the kinds of things that women, particularly needlewomen, were involved in making. Now, Women's Group did all sorts of interesting things to counter this, including, as I've said, setting up little workshops, factories. The Irish Women's Workers' Union set up a shirt-making factory. First jobs they gave were to the women who'd been locked out during the lockout, but that expanded. The Dublin branch of the Church League for Women's Suffrage, which was an Anglican organisation, employed 100 women who lost their jobs during the war. And they refused to stop their work, even during the chaos of the Easter Rising, and they made shirts. But employment opportunities for Irish women varied over the country, and they were not, on the whole, as greatly altered as they were in other parts of the British Isles. So these sort of visions that we have of women workers in the First World War on trams and buses and this kind of thing as conductors didn't really seem to happen in Ireland. Neither was Ireland hit by khaki fever in the way that Britain was, although there was this huge fear that there was going to be this sort of outpouring of sexual immorality all over Ireland in 1914, and it never happens here. Whether it actually happened anywhere else in the UK is another question, but it certainly doesn't happen here. Now, Ulster women in particular benefited from increased demand on linen mills and shirt making, and agricultural workers too benefited from higher demand for their products, and the agricultural workforce actually increased by 20% over the war, and that's quite a big change given that particularly tillage increases, which has obviously been going down for the last 100 years in Ireland. Now, the underemployed or the unemployed, on the other hand, were especially disadvantaged by rising prices and the scarcity of some foods. Munitions factories, and that's another thing that we imagine that women are doing, are munitions girls. They're actually very few and far between in Ireland. They employ there are 4 government munitions factories set up in Ireland, in Dublin, Waterford, Cork and Galway. But it doesn't become a major employer of women. Perhaps 1,400 women found work there. And the only reason those factories are established is because John Redmond and some of the other Irish politicians are putting pressure on the government because they're absolutely convinced that Ireland's being left out of this kind of development. Here's some munitions. This is another PRONI thank you picture, one of my few non-blearing ones. This is the Belfast factory. You can see they're making bullets or bombs or something. Shells. That's the word. This is one of the government ones in Dublin. This is the women going out for lunch, apparently, walking past their things they've made, or something else. You just stay there for a minute. Probably the bigger impact on employment during the war is actually the complete halt to immigration to America in the first half of 1915. This affects employment opportunities enormously. Because Ireland had a relatively high unemployment rate, particularly in certain areas before the war, it meant that the gaps that were left by the men who enlisted were actually quite easily filled by other men who didn't emigrate as they were expected to. Nonetheless, unemployment was virtually wiped out in the urbanised east and north of the country, as wartime demand was able in the end to absorb the people who might ordinarily have emigrated if you happen to be flexible and if you happen to live in the right part of the country. In the rest of the country, things weren't quite as rosy. The demand for essential goods and munitions, nonetheless, as I say, did in the end mean that you probably had a better chance of getting a job during the war than you had before it. And as David Fitzpatrick recently argued, wages largely kept pace with inflation, while earning and working conditions generally improved, despite, and in some industries really very sharply, especially munitions. But this doesn't always work for women. The sectors in which women were employed in the largest numbers before the war were domestic service and agriculture, and that remained the same. And domestic service is so difficult to know exactly what people were paid, but it's pretty clear that it was pretty exploitative industry in all sorts of ways. You can see why lots of women wanted to go and work in factories if they were available, because you usually got paid more and had more independence. But the hardship or otherwise of ordinary life varied across the country. We do know that poor law relief dropped over the poor years. We don't know why. It might be because some of the poorest members of society now had receipt of a separation allowance if a male breadwinner had enlisted or had a job. And in early 1915, again that's very blurry, These allowances totalled about just over 12 shillings for a wife and then a set amount for each child. Now for some people this is extremely good wage and it came on top of the army pay. If nothing else, it was regular, and that was something that many of Ireland's poorest people had not been used to. So that was something. As far as women were concerned, rural women probably did the best out of the wartime economy as they maintained access to food themselves, which is important, and they also enjoyed rising demand for agricultural products and also rising wages if they worked as agricultural labourers themselves. Now, some basic goods, especially milk, became more expensive during the war, and maternal mortality actually went up in the early years, which is interesting. I'm not sure why that is, but I suspect it might have been because some of the voluntary organisations that used to do things like provide milk and set up baby clinics, I think in the first months of the war slightly collapsed when they were getting used to the new conditions. Like the Women's National Health Association sort of didn't do very much for a little while, but things picked up very quickly. And by the end of the war, free milk is much more widely available to mothers, and there are real advances in maternal and infant welfare as well. Now, urban women were more prone to food shortages, though rationing was nowhere near as widespread as it was in the rest of the country. But if you lived in the city, you couldn't keep hens or grow vegetables, and that could be the difference between eating and eating well. One way that working women did clearly benefit, though, urban women from the war was a really sharp rise in trade union membership. And this happened with men as well, but it certainly happened with women. The stats are a bit odd. We know that in 1917, official British statistics say that there were about 17,000 women returned as members of 13 Irish unions. But this doesn't include the numbers of Irish women who joined British unions, so I'm not entirely sure. I'm still working on that at the moment. 17,000 is about 3 times as many as the number before the war, so that's quite a jump. Now, as well as working professionally or as volunteers, Irish women also threw themselves into relief work for soldiers. And the coordination of this for comforts and so on, and for dealing with prisoners of war and that kind of thing, effectively had 3 major bases: Belfast, Dublin and London. And this as well took on quite a political edge, despite the fact that, of course, this work was meant to be non-party and non-political. Now, the London work was mainly coordinated through the Irish Women's Association, and I have another blurry slide. This is a letter from this letter's all about getting something to a prisoner of war. But that's their logo at the top, and they're a very busy organisation. This was formed in 1915 to provide comforts, food and clothing to the Irish regiments, and its lists of patronesses included a very impressive number of duchesses and others, and some more obviously political names like Mrs. John Redmond. You can sort of get a sense of where that organisation's going. It said at least 100 times a day that it was non-party and non-political, but unionists were not so sure. Now, the rival Ulster Women's Gift Fund had been established just a little bit before the Irish Women's Association. It was based in Belfast, but worked, like the other organisation, mainly through London. And it was headed by Ladies Carson and Richardson, and Mrs. Craig and various others are involved in that one. Its membership list rivaled the Irish Women's Association in terms of titled women for sure. It also seemed to be, although it's very hard to get precise information, but it seemed to be in a stronger financial position than the other one, than the Irish Women's Association. From 1916, it's describing itself as being in a very strong financial position, which most organisations during the war don't, because they're always looking for more money. And it claims to collect about £750 a month from Ulster people exclusively, which is pretty impressive if it's true. And it resents what it... I found some fabulous letters not here in the old building about this. There's very sort of carping letters about what's going on in the different organisations to do with the regiments. But the Ulster Gift Fund really resents what it sees as the attempt of the Irish Women's Association to act for all of Ireland, and it's adamant that the Ulster Regiment should be left to the Ulster Women's Organisation. And this meant in practice that the Ulster organisation would pack and dispatch parcels and so on to the 3 Ulster regiments only, as they said, while its rival could take care of the others. Now, the division of labour and supplying this was really complex, and that's partly because some of the Irish regiments and battalions had their own committees which were based in Ireland and had nothing to do with these others. So there's all sorts of discussion about who's going to send socks to which battalion, who's going to send prisoner of war parcels and so on. They reached some kind of compromise in about 1917, but fairly tricky relations persist nonetheless. But in addition to catering to the needs of Irish soldiers, Irish women are also organising themselves in some quasi-military roles as well, apart from commandement, which is clearly quasi-military. So Lady Londonderry, Edith Londonderry, for example, set up the Women's Legion in 1915. And this was a body which put women in uniform under a semi-militaristic structure and encouraged them to do their duties as women, she said. Now, she had earlier been involved in setting up the Women's Volunteer Reserve, which was the first body to put women into a military but non-nursing roles. There's the Women Legion's cooks. I'm afraid they're not Irish ones, but I couldn't find any Irish ones. They did things like drivers, cooks, patrollers, that kind of stuff. Now, Edith Londonderry, did not want to produce what she described as a group of she-men. She absolutely believed that men and women should do different things, should do the duties that served their own particular sex. But she was also a women's suffragist who thought that this sort of organisation could really help to win the women's cause. The Women's Legion was formed in London, and she worked very hard to get it extended to Ireland, but she found this extremely difficult. There was a sense that, given her own strong association with Irish unionism, this would put people off, alienate potential recruits, and so on. Detachments did in the end become active in Belfast, Dublin and Cork, where women became drivers, cooks, patrollers of various kinds. And I think this is where you get closest to some of the ideas we have about women in the war, of driving trucks and wearing men's uniforms and that kind of stuff. They're apparently the object of ridicule a lot. They're teased, they're laughed at and so on. Nonetheless, this legion became the largest women's voluntary wartime association and the first to be officially recognised by the War Office in 1916. So that was a pretty impressive achievement. I don't know much about what they did in Ireland, and I'm still doing research at the moment on the First World War, so all this stuff is relatively new. Now, the response of the Irish women's suffrage societies to the war also provoked disagreement and controversy at times, although I wouldn't want to overstate that. The Irish Women's Franchise League, which was militant and Dublin-based, insisted straight away that any concession to what it described as warmongers would only undermine the moral strength of the demand for women's emancipation. And their form of opposition to the war included an absolute boycott on any kind of war work, even relief work with children, with refugees, anything like that. Now, this isn't a unique position, but it is a very unusual one across Europe, and it's certainly the only organisation that takes this view in Ireland, and one of the very few that takes this view in the UK. Margaret Connolly of the Franchise League kept urging members to do, as she said, stand fast by their organisation and reject the pleas of warmongers. But privately, from the stuff that I've seen, they were very unsuccessful at trying to enforce this. And they really, privately, their letters show that they are very worried that they're not going to be able to stop suffragists for supporting the war effort, and they're right to be worried. Majority of Irish suffragists, unionists, nationalists, militant, non-militant, urban, rural, they seem to believe that war work was acceptable and necessary, and that it could be kept separate from approval of the war itself. So you have quite a few Quaker women, for example, involved, who are obviously pacifists, who are involved in relief work, and they don't see that as a problem. And the willingness of Irish suffragists to work in relief in the war shouldn't really surprise us, given that we know that Irish society as a whole supported the war effort in the early years of the war. Nonetheless, the line between objectionable war work and acceptable relief work could be very fine. The Church League for Women's Suffrage, which I spoke about before, set up their factory for 100 women. They made shirts, and they came to employ more than 100 women, and amongst the items they produced were army shirts stamped with Suffrage War Relief Workroom on them. Did this workshop support women, or did it support militarism? This is one of the questions that they had to ask themselves. So there were strains between some of the groups. Again, I don't want to overemphasise this, because I think actually Irish suffrage groups hold together extremely well given the circumstances over the period. The Irish Women's Suffrage Federation, which is an umbrella group, which is like a coordinating group for most Irish women's suffrage societies, insisted at the start of the war that if suffragists dedicated themselves entirely to the war effort, that they did so, and she said, as suffragists and as much as possible through suffrage societies. So her society calls an emergency meeting in August 1914, and they decided that meeting that suffragists should include among their duties relief during the prison crisis. Right?
Attention please. Documents cannot be ordered after 8 p.m. It would be appreciated if documents no longer required are returned to the issue desk as soon as possible. Thank you for your cooperation.
So this federation and its various societies then put forward a whole lot of ideas about how women suffragists could actually expand their cause and could win support for their cause during the war. And they did a whole lot of things during the war. They left suffrage pamphlets on trains, on trams. They gave them to some of the prisoners that they were looking after, some of the men that they were looking after in hospitals, and they were encouraged to wear their suffrage badges at all times and to talk about suffrage while they were going about their war-related duties. They were probably deeply annoying to people who were probably just trying to get well. Now, Dora Malone, who's one of my favourite women, she was secretary of the Warren Point Suffrage Society, which was actually bizarrely one of the most active suffrage societies in Ireland, that one in Lisbon. She became the active secretary of the Suffrage Emergency Council as well, and they insisted that women's involvement in war work should not come at the expense of the rights of working women, and she campaigned for all sorts of things women were doing during the war. One of the victories that she won, which was actually quite a difficult one, was to bring back Ireland's only 2 women factory inspectors who'd been shipped off to Scotland and London, and she had them brought back to Dublin and Belfast. And suffragists had fought really hard to get these 2 paid women inspectors, so they really wanted them back, and they got them back. This doesn't mean that all feminists thought that trying to combine suffrage and war relief work was successful. Some of them thought that women's rights were in fact eroded during the war. But these appeared to be in the minority. As I've already said, very few suffrage societies stopped suffrage work altogether. Most combined it with relief work, and many did this in the explicit expectation that this would bode well for their cause after the war. The majority of suffragists, as far as I can see, really did seem to believe that the war had opened doors for women, no matter what their own personal views of the Irish participation in it. The Irish Women's Suffrage and Local Government Association, which was Ireland's oldest suffrage association, for example, maintained that the war had increased the likelihood of granting the parliamentary franchise. And in 1917, it declared that the march of events had become a triumphal procession towards our long-desired goal. The president of the Irish Women's Suffrage Association agreed, and she argued that the war had allowed women to display their organising powers. Dora Malone, mentioned before, went further. She claimed in 1916 that suffrage work was actually easier during the war than before it, that people were more accepting of it. Edith Somerville of the Munster Women's Franchise League, another one of these very active leagues around the country, started to think about the position of women after the war in Ireland as early as 1915, when she and Violet Martin, that's Somerville and Ross, who were very, very involved in suffrage activities, they compiled a record of the magnificent work done by suffragists and argued that in the future this would form an argument in our favour, hardly to be gainsaid, and that's a very interesting document that they put together. 1914, the Church League for Women's Suffrage was predicting that if women failed to be enfranchised during the general rearrangement of affairs at the close of the war, as they called it, they would be without it for many years hence. They saw it as a great opportunity. Edith Londonderry even accepted a bet in 1915 that women would have won their case by the end of the war. Women had, she insisted, only have ever wanted the opportunity to prove themselves, and she would have won her bet. Now, you could argue, of course, that suffragists were, of course, going to say these things and to claim concessions in the light of their work. But I think the idea that something's changed for women is broader than just the suffrage organisations. One of the things that I looked at was, I don't know if anyone's looked at it, but it's a magazine called Lady of the House, which is very kind of, it's not a very intellectual magazine, shall we say, for women. It's mainly clothes and that kind of thing, balls, courts, things that are going on in the court and that sort of stuff. And it goes through a real transformation during the war. In 1914, it declares that Irish women had come out trumps in the war debate, as they said. And its commentary, when the war begins, it has sort of sections on which VADs wear the most chic uniforms and this kind of stuff. This disappears really, really quickly. And by 1915, it's got a regular section called the Women's Parliament, and they're debating really quite serious issues on dress reform, women in post-World War, future of the blue stocking, and so on. And the verdict amongst its readers appeared to be unanimous. And it's unanimous, and they know, they're saying, whatever happens with the national question, we're sure that women are going to progress, whoever's in charge. Miss Maud White of Hollywood, who's a regular contributor, said, in respect of women's employment, the European war is admittedly a war of liberation, as the advent of the munitions girls and other workers predict the age of fewer accomplishments and more achievements, fewer opinions and more convictions, fewer dilettantes and more scholars, fewer ladies and more women, which I think is fabulous. On a more practical level, there's a lot of discussion about the clothes that women were wearing. Mrs. Hanrahan from Cork wrote a really interesting letter where she talks about how women during the war years had experienced the convenience and comfort of a working outfit and would not readily swathe their poor limbs in yards and yards of useless stuff, and so on. And that's just one example of how things seem to have shifted, and it really seems to be fairly uniform in everything that I've seen. I should probably stop. But just very briefly say that one of the other things that I've been looking at is the impact of the war on social reform and on social issues in Ireland. And I think anyone who thinks that Ireland knew nothing, didn't talk about sex, wasn't interested in sex, and this is all taboo, just really needs to go and read the press, pre-war press and post-war press, because it's everywhere. Divorce, sex scandals, and so on. Everyone's obsessed with it. And all these interests really come to the fore, or these issues come to the fore during the war, partly because there is this belief, as I was saying before, that Ireland's going to be overrun by sexual promiscuity because of the war, and it doesn't happen. So the outbreak of war does present reformist and feminist women with all sorts of opportunities to pursue some of their favourite causes and to tackle new social problems and those that they believe will be exacerbated by the war. And one of the main manifestations of this is what becomes known as the Irish Women Patrols, which is a voluntary civic police force composed entirely of volunteer women. So you've got volunteer women police in Belfast and Dublin during the war. And they were there to, as I said, look after the welfare of girls in the city and persuade young women who were found to be loitering or behaving in an unseemly manner on the streets to go home. They went out nightly in 2-hour shifts. Each shift consisted of 2 women, one a Protestant, one a Catholic, always. Non-sectarian, non-political, gains the support of the police, who were initially very opposed to this organisation. They were allowed to wear badges, they could get the help of police if necessary, but their expenses were met entirely out of subscriptions, and it was a difficult thing for a working woman to do because they had to volunteer in the evenings but also be free the whole next day for the courts, because they often acted as witnesses. And nearly everybody they took to court was a man rather than a woman, and they were very proud of this because they wanted to reverse the prejudice of the law against women. And I can tell you all sorts of things about the women police, but they're very interesting. But what they do, Irish feminists have been arguing for a long time that they needed women police. They felt that women weren't treated properly in the legal system because they were all male police, etc., and judges and lawyers. By the end of the war, you have professional women working as police in Belfast and Dublin. Over the 1920s, as they retire, they're eroded, their positions, but you do get a victory insofar as I think there are 4 or 5 in Belfast by the end of the war and about 8 in Dublin, paid up policewomen, which is pretty impressive. One of the things that's really, for me anyway, about the police force that's interesting is that they really do participate in a very interesting debate about what they call their accounts of life on the beat, and they participate in a really interesting and detailed discussion about what it's like to be poor effectively in Belfast and Dublin. And they talk about the sorts of things they see when they're on patrol, the sadness, what they would call immorality. And some of their reports, I have to say, I was absolutely shocked at how frank they were at some of the things they were seeing. They talked about prostitution, and very openly male and female prostitution. They talked about paedophiles who followed young girls around. These are really important discoveries, and they go along with a whole lot of other things that some other women are doing, like All sorts of societies are set up to make sure that women are being monitored in courtrooms. The volunteer women go and sit in courts to make sure that any case to do with women and children isn't entirely dominated by men. There's a whole lot of women who get involved in looking at pubs, and there's a whole series of 100 people in Dublin who go out to every single pub over a period of 4 months and take notes on who's there, are they flouting the drinking laws, can they offer them tea if they ask for it, all this sort of stuff. And they're very, very clear that they don't mind if people drink. It's not about temperance. They just don't want the law flouted, because women's suffragists have for a long time argued that alcohol is one of the enemies of women's suffrage, because if men drink, their families don't get any food, they get violent, and so on and so forth. Women went so far as to argue that Ireland had been described for a long time as a clerically ridden country, but it was in fact a publican-ridden country. There's a really long history of alcohol and women's suffrage in Ireland, which women both north and south had a real issue with. Now, alcohol consumption was, in fact, speaking of social life, was generally curtailed during the war, and it was largely through the imposition of restrictions on pubs and also on output. By 1918, the brewing output in Ireland was half of what it had been in 1916. Nonetheless, because of a very powerful alcohol lobby, both powerful in unionist and nationalist circles, it remained the case, as David Fitzpatrick recently said, that it was much easier to get drunk in Ireland than it was anywhere else in the British Isles over the war years. Now, although a lot of these middle-class organisations I've been talking about just briefly here, people who are looking at pubs, who are looking at policing and so on, they are concerned by the behaviour and conditions of the poor, particularly of poor women. And much of this debate about vice, and there is a huge debate about vice going on in this period, and social reform was definitely spearheaded by middle-class men and women. And it would be naive to imagine that all Irish women's war-related experiences were not similarly shaped by these sorts of geographical, political, social, religious differences. Economic hardship and involvement in the war was obviously unevenly felt across the country. But I do think that the determination to do their bit created a really unique situation in Ireland, and it united women in some ways, and it also changed their lives in the long run. I'll stop there. Thank you.